If you just say the word Atlantis to Zahi Hawass, he goes berserk. He absolutely goes nuts. And that's irrational too, since we know that the Atlantis story comes from Plato. We know that Plato said the source of that story was in ancient Egypt, in the temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta. An ancestor, Solon, visited that temple and was told the story, which he put into the word. Atlantis is not an ancient Egyptian word. That's one of the problems. But he called it Atlantis. But at Edfu in Upper Egypt, there's a whole story of a homeland of the primeval ones that was destroyed in a great cataclysm and flooded by the sea, leaving only a few survivors who traveled around the world seeking to restart civilization. It's told very clearly in the Edfu building texts, which fortunately have now been completely translated. Sadly, only into German. I hope we'll see the full English translation in due course. But the translations I was working from when I first studied them are very good, and they've been reinforced and supported by this new fuller translation. So I think the Atlantis story does have an ancient Egyptian origin, and I think the ancient Egyptians should be proud of it rather than throwing it away. And also, archaeologists should not seek to isolate the story of Atlantis from other flood myths and traditions all around the world. And that's a problem too. I mean, we have hundreds of myths and traditions from countries all around the globe which speak of a great global cataclysm, a huge flood, often wildfires, destruction of human beings and of animals, a few survivors who seek to restart civilization. It's a global story, not a single story told by Plato.
And, I mean, if you hear the same story from so many different cultures, at what point in time do you go, maybe there's something to this? I mean, it's just very strange to try to deny that.
Again, we have this...
Especially with the physical evidence.
Yeah, especially with the physical evidence. And it's interesting with the physical evidence, like Göbekli Tepe, which is 11,600 years old. I mean, it used to be argued, Robert Schoch and John Anthony West's work on the Great Sphinx, suggesting that the Sphinx could be 12,000 plus years old. It used to be argued that was impossible because there was no other site anywhere in the world, no other megalithic site of the same age. And then we discover Göbekli Tepe, and it's 11,600 years old. Now, if you can make Göbekli Tepe with its 20-ton megaliths, beautifully carved representations of human and animal figures in those pillars, if you can do that, you can cut the Great Sphinx out of bedrock as well. There's no reason to dismiss the geological evidence of the Great Sphinx anymore. But instead, what archaeology is doing is trying to finesse Göbekli Tepe. They're trying to say, oh, there was this gradual build-up to Göbekli Tepe. And they now talk about a people who they call the Natufians. Again, we don't know what they called themselves, who were predecessors of Göbekli Tepe around 14,000 years ago. And they show things that look like a tiny little stone wall that they built, the sort of thing that you can find, a dry stone wall that you can find anywhere in Wales to this day, you know. And this is supposed to be a prequel to Göbekli Tepe. I'm sorry, you just don't start off making dry stone walls and then wake up one morning and create 20-ton megaliths in huge stone circles, perfectly astronomically aligned, as we have at Göbekli Tepe.
Not only that, but how? Like, what did they do? Where are you getting those 20-ton megaliths from? How far do they have to transport?
In the case of Göbekli Tepe, not far.
How far?
Hundreds of meters. I've stood on top of one megalith that they partially cut out of the bedrock with the T-shape, but then they found a fault in it and they left it there. Oh. It would have been a 30-ton megalith. They clearly intended to release it from the bedrock, but it had a fault, so they left it alone. The quarries, the issue of the quarries for the rock at Göbekli Tepe is not too big a problem.
But the transportation of those?
Even the transportation, you get enough people working together, and they can move large stones. That's not in dispute. But that's where the question comes: how do you get enough people together? How do you have the organizational skills? Where do you have the mindset that plans something like this at the beginning? And that is the problem that is not answered in the case of Göbekli Tepe. That happening suddenly.
And what were they using for tools?
They're supposed to have just been using stone. There's not supposed to have been any metals at that period.
Not even brass.
Not even brass. Not even copper. I have a complicated view on Göbekli Tepe. Let's say it's my hypothesis. It's not a fact. I don't claim this is a fact. I think that what we're looking at Göbekli Tepe, there's no doubt that the population of around Göbekli Tepe were all hunter-gatherers when Göbekli Tepe started to be made. And that's the weirdest thing of all, because previously archaeology always used to say hunter-gatherer cultures did not have the manpower, did not have the organizational skills, could not generate the surpluses that would allow people to specialize in architecture and engineering and astronomy and so on. So it used to be said that hunter-gatherers couldn't do that. Now archaeologists have backpedaled on that and they're saying, well, yeah, clearly hunter-gatherers did it. The funny thing is that during the 1,000 years that Göbekli Tepe functions, and it runs from roughly 11,600 years ago to, say, 9,600 years ago, during the 10,600 years ago, during those 1,000 years, the population of Göbekli Tepe transitions from being hunter-gatherers to being agriculturalists. So we see two new ideas suddenly appearing at Göbekli Tepe: enormous megalithic architecture and a shift from hunter-gathering to agriculture. And what Göbekli Tepe looks like to me is a transfer of technology, that people who already knew how to work megalithic architecture and align it precisely to the risings of particular stars, for example, Sirius, came to Göbekli Tepe at a time of chaos and cataclysm in the world, and they sought to introduce a new way of thinking. I think Göbekli Tepe was created as a project to mobilize the local community, to give them something to work on, to bring them together. And it's not an accident that during that 1,000 years they transitioned from hunter-gathering to agriculture. I don't see massive technical complications in creating Göbekli Tepe, except those very precise alignments. But what I do see is a sudden appearance of something that shouldn't have been there, and that requires explanation.
How did they determine the emergence of agriculture versus agriculture that it existed in some areas and not others, like it does now? Like you can go to the Amazon and you can see hunter-gatherers, and then you can go to Sao Paulo and see a major metropolitan city.
I was just in Manaus, and it's fascinating, actually. They have a tower up there on the edge of the jungle. You can go up that tower 150 meters up, and on one side, extending endlessly, infinitely into the distance, is the Amazon rainforest. Wow. Turn the other way, and there's the city of Manaus.
Wow!
Looking at you with its skyscrapers.
That's got to be wild.
It's a wild sight to see, actually, the interesting thing about the Amazon, Joe, is it's been grievously misunderstood over the years, and fortunately, archaeology is beginning to come to terms with it. There was agriculture in the Amazon, going back a very long way, going back at least 10,000 years, maybe further. And we may have discussed this before, but there's this curious soil that exists in the Amazon that they call terra preta, or Amazonian dark earth.